The Federal Reserve has proposed new pay practices at banks and is now looking at 28 of the largest firms to ensure that compensation packages don't create incentives for risky behavior. But is this just adding to an ever-growing list of powers of the Federal Reserve? Is this good for the markets and for the economy? Gary Burtless is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He focuses on income distribution. Gary, when you heard this announcement from the Fed yesterday that they're now looking at compensation, what was your reaction?
Well, I think that it's very sensible and long overdue. The question is whether the rather general guidelines the Fed has proposed are going to actually be enforced with zealous oversight.
Well, the Fed yesterday said they will take enforcement action against banks where risk management practices pose a risk to the safety of an organization. That's a little backwards looking, it seems.
Well, what isn't backward looking is to look at the content of the compensation agreements between firms and their senior officers and traders. If the Fed believes that these agreements give way too much emphasis to short-term gains and too little emphasis to the long-term consequences of the additional risk that these officers are taking on, presumably their overseers are going to come down hard. But we don't know. This has never been tested as far as I know.
Now, how do you see this language from the Federal Reserve differing from what we've heard from the pay czar, Ken Feinberg himself? Are they on the same page here?
Not really. The announcement about the 7 firms that are very heavily indebted to the federal government is basically oversight. These companies are essentially owned by the United States government, or a majority of them are. Some are not, but a majority are, and all of them are deep in hock to the federal government. And so in the case of the pay czar, he's just looking into the oversight responsibilities in behalf of the taxpayer. I mean, we're major stakeholders in these firms. In the case of the Fed, it's making statements about how it will deal with compensation of large banks that are very important to the system, but in which we do not have direct stakes as equity holders.
Right. It's a broader issue of compensation beyond just those accepting TARP funds. When you put this in the context of the language that we've heard from the Federal Reserve, from Washington most recently, about making the Fed potentially a super regulator, what is this? What impression do you walk away with? I mean, what is the Federal Reserve going to look like a year from now? What role, if you add up all these components, is the Fed going to have?
Well, in this specific area, they certainly will have much, much more oversight responsibility than the Federal Reserve has ever taken on, because they will be investigating the inside arrangements of companies. How do I compensate my senior officers? How do I compensate my traders? And that's not a responsibility, to my knowledge, that the Fed has ever undertaken. So it's certainly very important. But we've got to remember, almost everyone who has looked at the financial crisis agrees that bad compensation arrangements with senior officers played a role. I'm not saying an overwhelming role, but a role in the huge amount of risk that these office holders allowed their institutions to take on. Certainly, the office holders, the officers of banks and other financial institutions were guilty of boneheaded errors, and boneheaded errors are going to be made even under an ideal compensation arrangement. But the compensation arrangement did contribute to people making these boneheaded errors in the same direction in many large firms all at once.
But when you hear from some of the biggest names on Wall Street, or some very well-known, very successful individuals, Ken Langone among them, founder of Home Depot, who comes out and says, you know, if he was going to have brain surgery, an inherently risky endeavor, he'd want the best person out there, and presumably because he's the best, he'd be paid the most. What do you say when you hear comments like that? You say, well, people who are incredibly responsible for outsized growth should be compensated in an oversized fashion.
Well, a lot of what banks do should be boring. In the last 2 or 3 years, what they did had the feeling of a great adventure in a casino. It would be better, probably, if the major banks that have systemically very important role in the economy were managed in a much more risk-averse way. So the notion that we're not attracting the world's biggest risk takers to this industry should come as a relief to most of us. That's not a demerit of these kinds of constraints on compensation.
All right. Thank you so much. Gary Burtless of the Brookings Institution joining us live from Washington. Give us a little perspective on this hot topic.